say that this is, okay, that will be recording, so thank you for that. And also, this is one of a few different webinars we hope to offer in the future. We're really working on establishing our teacher community this year and supporting you and engaging with you and collaborating with you. And so this is just one of many ways that we invite you to participate in Generation Global and help us build a strong Generation Global teacher community. So lots more coming, and please stay tuned. We got a lot of other exciting events that will be coming up in the next few months. So today, though, we are very pleased and honored to bring to you Dr. Neil Phillipson for this webinar about dialogue in science education. And just very quickly, Neil is a former pharmaceutical chemist who spent 10 years teaching science in the UK before becoming a trainer and a consultant. He is also a trainer and a proponent for the philosophy of children and an affiliate of Oracy Cambridge. He's co-authored a book in 2017 called Dialogic Education, Mastering Core Concepts Through Thinking Together. And he's co-authored that with Professor Rupert Wegerif of Cambridge University. And Neil has also been, you might have seen Neil if you've done our VCs, Neil has also been a lead facilitator of dialogue with Generation Global since 2018. So lots of rich experience there in dialogue and in the discipline area. So without further ado, Neil, I would love to turn it over to you, and everyone, please enjoy. Thanks.
Many thanks, Lisa. And hello and welcome to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here with people from so many different places. It's an exciting event. Ironically, in a talk about dialogue, I have a feeling that with a large group size, there may not be many opportunities for, well, dialogue as we go through the session today. I'll invite you to use the chat at various points to share some of your ideas and thoughts on some questions I'll raise. Forgive me if I don't get the opportunity to respond directly to you during the talk, but I think if we can try to save some time at the end for any questions that you have, then that would probably be the best way to proceed today. So let me, without further ado, begin sharing the slides with you. You see my contact details there, and please do feel free to get in touch if you'd like to for any reason after the talk. And so some questions perhaps that I shall try to pose and offer some possible answers to in the relatively brief time we have together. So we might look at why dialogue might be important in education generally, but in science education in particular. We might think about how we may create more opportunities for dialogue during science lessons, having established why that might be a good idea. And I want to acknowledge that dialogue in classrooms is perhaps not as easy as it might first appear, and it does need to be practiced. So how can we begin to build a classroom culture in which dialogue has a chance of flourishing in our classrooms? So hopefully we'll get time to discuss each of those questions within the hour. We may begin actually by asking ourselves what we mean by dialogue. And I'm here looking at the roots of the English word, which has its roots in the Greek language, taken from dia, which means across or between or through, suggesting we're talking about something, a gap here, a gap of difference perhaps, and logos, which means word or speech or reason. So perhaps we're talking about some kind of speech or reasoning across a gap of difference. Might be something we're meaning when we use the term dialogue. I'd love to ask you about similar terms in your own languages actually, and their etymological roots. Maybe that's something you'd be willing to share in the chat with each other, because it's always interesting to see where these words come from in different traditions. just looking briefly at some modern definitions of dialogue. Here's the Generation Global definition that we share with our schools. So, the process by which I can come to understand others' lives, values, and beliefs, and others can come to understand mine. That works very well in the context of our Generation Global video conferences, where we have students perhaps seeking to understand each other across a gap of cultural difference. My colleague Rupert Wegerif gives this simple definition of this reason across difference, and maybe that begins to hint at how it can be applied in the classroom and in science education, because of course there always will be differences in perspectives and understandings, differences between your students' perspectives and yours, or the discipline of science's perspective, if you will, and differences between different students' understandings of concepts, for example, within the science lesson. So it may be a good thing if we can somehow reason across those differences and try to build bridges of understanding certainly between teachers and students. And my colleague Roger Sutcliffe at Dialogue Works offers perhaps even a simpler definition, in this context at least, of talking together for better understanding. And if we can achieve that with our students and achieve a deeper and richer understanding of some of the ideas we're sharing, then that would seem to be a good thing. Just a slight word of warning as we begin. I work with, one of my jobs is to work with trainee teachers. And this is an episode I observed with one of my trainee teachers just the other day. I think he'd be mortified if I knew I was sharing this, but anyway. He was talking to children of just 6 years of age about the changes in the seasons, and asking them, as you can see there, how they might recognize summer as a season. What might they see? And you can see the brief exchange that I've recorded here. Again, you might like to share in the chat with each other whether you regard this as a dialogue. And if not, why not? It's an exchange, isn't it? It's two people talking together. Is that not a dialogue? I'll just give you a moment to share some thoughts with each other if you'd like to. I hope you will be able to use the chat as to sustain your own dialogue of a sort anyway during the session. So Keith saying, no, not really a dialogue. Alexandra, well, the teacher's just ignored the student's response. It's leading. And so on. You can see lots more ideas popping up there. And so, well, let's have a look at what we might expect to see if this were more dialogic. Is this teacher really listening to his students' response? Doesn't seem so. Doesn't seem to have really taken on board the answer of bright colours there. Certainly doesn't seem to have responded to it or valued it in any way. Hasn't called for a justification or an explanation of that answer. Hasn't called the student out to think. And hasn't really succeeded then in drawing that student into a relationship of mutual understanding or mutual interest. And I think, in many ways, it's in that relationship where the education happens. And I remember I talked to this student afterwards, and he said, well, when she said bright colours, I was afraid that she meant the blossom on the trees. And that's not a sign of summer, that's a sign of spring. So that would have been the wrong answer. And I didn't want to hear that. I wanted to refocus her on what I was looking for, which was the fact that the leaves of the trees are in leaf in the summer. Well, there's pedagogic reasoning there, but I wonder if there was an opportunity missed as well. So I would stress that even though we have an exchange here between a teacher and student, we don't necessarily have a dialogue. So why does that matter? And how can dialogue support learning anyway? Well, I'm sure you've seen this cartoon before. But for me, it's communicating the idea that teaching and learning is, of course, a two-way process. We can do what we can to, in some sense, transmit new information to our students. but they need to be active in receiving that information and making sense of it for themselves, making meaning of it for themselves, taking ownership of it, making sure that knowledge becomes meaningful to them. And I want to argue that dialogue is one way in which we can give our students the opportunity to make sense, make meaning, take ownership of what we're trying to teach them. So I'd like to suggest that when we're working with our students, we can operate in two modes. So we can take on an authoritative voice. We can be in authoritative mode, by which I might mean, or which might be characterized by us putting in information in some way, lecturing, explaining, demonstrating, instructing. Now, let me say from the beginning, this is, of course, not bad teaching. It's essential. You try teaching without careful explanation and clear instruction. Of course, it's important, and it's perfectly appropriate that our students spend some time listening relatively passively, reciting, memorizing information that we're trying to teach them. I would argue that that is essential, but I would also argue that it's not sufficient if we want that deeper level of understanding. So I think that teachers, we as teachers, myself included, need to learn to switch between that authoritative mode and one that we might characterize as being more dialogic, in which we're now trying to suspend the business of putting in, and we're trying to draw out what sense the student has made of what we've tried to teach them, to draw out the students' understandings, to bring the students' perspectives, intention together, to expose them to challenge, and to genuinely listen. And this is the trick: if you want to teach in dialogue, to genuinely put aside all those concerns about your break duty coming up and all the other things that are going on, and genuinely listen to what the student has to say and see if that can inform our teaching. And of course, at that time, then the students need to be more active and responding to what's being said, reflecting on what's being said, making sense of what's being said, reconstructing this knowledge for themselves so that it makes sense to them, revoicing it in their own words so that they take ownership of this knowledge. It becomes theirs. It's passed from my knowledge, or the knowledge of science, to our knowledge. And we want the students to be thinking in this time. And so, I guess this is a little bit simple, but an argument here is that we need a balance between these two modes, maybe even a cycle between the two, of putting information in and giving the students the opportunity to make sense of it themselves, teacher the chance to listen and respond before perhaps putting in some more. I think maybe this sounds fairly obvious, but when you continue to look at the research, it suggests to us that when you analyze classroom interaction, you see significantly more, a lot more, of the authoritative style and relatively little of the dialogic style. So I guess my argument is not that we need to remove authoritative teaching, it's essential, but that we need a better balance between the authoritative and the dialogic. Here's a little transcript of another lesson I observed. So here the teacher is asking the students, how do we see the moon? The moon's not a light source, so how do we see it? And I'll let you read the exchange between the teacher and two students, S1 and S2. And again, you might like to share some thoughts with each other. Would you regard this, based on what we've said so far, is this teacher in authoritative mode, or is this teacher in dialogic mode? I do wonder what you think. Gustav very quickly saying, well, that's authoritative. I wonder if others agree or disagree. I'm going to agree with Rustan and say I think that is the teacher working in an authoritative mode for similar reasons, I guess, to the ones we looked at in the first transcript. That the teacher in this case seems to be listening out only for the right answer that he or she wants to be heard and reinforced. Maybe she heard or he heard the surprising answer, the first answer shines through it, miss. Maybe he or she didn't even hear that because we're so intent on listening for the right answer. I don't think this is bad teaching. There's a time and a place for making sure that the right answer is heard and reinforced again. But this fits into a pattern that we know as IRE interaction: initiate, respond, evaluate, where the teacher initiates an exchange with a question that requires a relatively short answer quite often. The student responds with that short answer, and the teacher fairly quickly evaluates that answer as correct or incorrect. And again, as I say, there's a time and a place for this, for sure. But again, the research tells us, the research I'm aware of anyway, tells us that there's an awful lot of this, more than we care to think. If we analyse the interactions in our classrooms, this pattern occurs again and again. So it serves a purpose, but is there also potentially a missed opportunity? Is there another way that we could have engaged with these students? So I'll show you the alternative version, and let me just give you a moment to read through this. Obviously, I'm going to argue this is more dialogic. I won't ask you that, but have a look. So one question I put to you about this one is, if we accept for the moment that this is more dialogic, at what point can you visibly see the teacher turning toward that dialogic mode? At what point in this conversation does this exchange become more recognizably dialogic? Again, I'm scurrying to the chat so I can see. You can see Alexander saying that the teacher is more, Payal's saying the teacher is facilitating, and Alexander's saying that the teacher allows the students to discuss with each other here, as opposed to simply a teacher-student back interaction. Lots more responses than I'm able to read at the moment, but I hope you're enjoying engaging in that dialogue. The point, a rhetorical question really, at what point does this turn toward the dialogic? And we often talk about the third turn in these exchanges. If you can see me moving my cursor around. So we've got the first turn here with the teacher initiating just as before, and the student responding in the second turn just as before. But the third turn, the teacher now resists that evaluation and shows interest this time in what the student has to say. Here's this surprising answer, and shows that orientation of interest and seeks to understand. And then I guess another question, and I know some of you are answering this already in the chat, is, well, actually, why? Is this good? Is this better than the last exchange we looked at in some sense? What's going on here? Well, again, you can share thoughts with each other on that, and I guess it is contestable, and it's context dependent to a degree as well. But we can see that teacher valuing the student and their contribution. We can see them turning and showing interest and calling that student out to justify their thinking, calling that student out to think, giving opportunity for others to respond, giving opportunity for that student to be challenged within a dialogue, actually, to see if they can engage in this business of reconstructing their understanding through a dialogic interaction. The teacher at the end there joins the dialogue as well, having unearthed an important misconception, I think, here about the way that light is reflected. And so at the very least, I think the teacher now has a better understanding of an important misconception that was out there that he or she may not have already been aware of. And perhaps we have a better opportunity through the dialogue to challenge the misconception and encourage students to rethink. We have a chance to talk across that difference and reason across that difference, I guess. There's an important point here. There is a right answer to this question. We can't leave this classroom and say, well, isn't that interesting? We've got 5 different ways in which we think we can see the moon. Isn't that good? We can't do that, of course, in this situation. There is a right answer. And so at some point, the teacher has to step out of that dialogic mode and return to the authoritative mode and say, look, the right answer is reflection. Let me try to explain this again, but at least now I'm armed with an understanding of where you're coming from, or some of you are coming from. Let me see if I can address that with you. So again, it's that notion of a balance between the interactive, the authoritative and the dialogic, and the ability to switch backwards and forwards between the two, perhaps, that I'm arguing for. I'm just scanning quickly up and down the chat to see if anything is appearing to challenge any of these thoughts. As I say, I'm very open to taking your questions later on this. So how do we, if we become convinced and we decide we'd like to see a bit more of this kind of interaction in our classrooms, how can we begin to go down that line? This work comes from a publication called the Talk Science Primer by Sarah Michaels and Kathy O'Connor from the US. Incidentally, I've shared with Lisa a list of references that I'm drawing on here. So if anybody's interested in having references like the Michaels and O'Connor one, that we can provide those to you if you'd like to find out more. Anyway, amongst other things that they were saying, they said, look, if you want to get your students engaged in some sort of academically productive discussion, not just a dialogue for the sake of it, but one that is purposeful and gives a product, well, we need to do these 4 things at least. We need to create an environment in which students feel comfortable to share, not just to sit and wait till they feel safe that they've got the right answer because they don't want to risk the humiliation of offering a wrong answer. We have to create an environment in which students understand that all authentic answers are welcome because they help that interactive process of teaching and learning. We have to create a safe space for the students, a brave space for the students to engage in that kind of dialogue. We have to actively encourage them to speak out, to elaborate, to clarify, in a non-threatening way so that they can be understood. And then perhaps we also have this job of getting them to orientate so that they truly listen, not just to the teacher, but to each other. And I always feel that's the gateway to any real dialogue. It's not so much about the speaking, it's about the genuine listening and interest in what others have to say, treating each other as potential sources of valuable learning, valuing each other. So what can we do as teachers to encourage students to respond to each other? First of all, to truly listen to each other. And maybe at that point, we're ready to deepen their reasoning, to call for justification of their ideas, to offer some challenge to those ideas, to try that business of reasoning across difference and seeing if we can understand each other's perspectives more fully. And ultimately, we mentioned the word facilitation earlier. The teacher here is acting as facilitator of the child's thinking. But hopefully that facilitation process can become distributed so that it's not just the teacher, that the students are beginning to think together. So we need to begin to encourage them to respond to each other, to agree to disagree, to build on each other's ideas. So we start to cumulatively produce something in our dialogues. Let's just spend a brief moment looking at this in more detail. This may be one sort of practical outcome you can take from this hour we have together. As a teacher, we can talk about the various ways of building a safe space for dialogue in our classrooms. I'll come back to that in a little while, but are there questions we can ask? Are there moves we can make to encourage our students to share, to elaborate, to make themselves understood? And again, you're more than welcome to share ideas with each other in the chat, because of course there's no one right answer to this question. There's lots of things we can do. And I'm sure lots of things you do already. that would be really valuable to share with each other. Not seeing the chat buzzing, so I'll put some up. Again, these of course are not the right answers. Some things we could do. We talk a lot about think, pair, share in the UK, have done for 20 years and more. Very old technique, but a very valuable one. If you're asking the students a tricky question, then it seems reasonable to give them some time to think about it. And then perhaps to share their emerging ideas with a partner in a safe way, because there's no threat, before being willing to share with the class. And that way we tend to get much more interesting, elaborated answers. But just those simple moves of showing interest and saying, go on, keep going, say more, go on, can be a really powerful move. I'm calling for that clarification. Let me see if I've got you right. Is this what you're saying? Or you know, encouraging them to clarify for themselves. Can you rephrase that? Can you give me the headlines of what you've just said there? Can you give me an example of that so I can understand you better? And again, same questions really. So having done that, how can we as facilitators, if you will, encourage our students to truly listen to each other? What moves might we, or these talk moves, what moves might we make to do that? 2 thoughts popping up in the chat at this point. So Robert saying Voice 21 has many great ideas for this. Lots of sources of these talk moves, actually, if you want to do some research. Voice 21, an organisation in the UK, promoting oracy and dialogic teaching as a part of that. Well, let's move on with these things. Can anyone put what has just been said into their own words? Can anyone summarize what's been said? Is there a question that we need to ask our speaker so that we can understand him or her more fully? Let's try to understand each other. And then in terms of beginning to trying to get that reasoning going, well, obviously, why do you think that? What's your justification? Is there evidence to support your view, perhaps in the data that we're looking at a science discussion? Is there a counterexample? Is there a counter argument? Is there another point of view? We want the students to start reasoning across those differences. And then we want them to start doing that together, not necessarily waiting for the teacher's call, but starting to think together. But we can prompt that. Who agrees? Who disagrees? Is what A is saying the same as what B is saying, or is that something different? What do you think? Who can build on this? Who can take this further? And again, of course, these kinds of questions are nothing new to you, I'm sure, but all I can say is that, again, that research where classroom interaction is analysed suggests that these moves aren't used as often as we might think. And so one practical outcome might be, if you're looking to engage students in those more extended sequences of dialogue, this is some stuff you can practice, just trying to introduce some of these moves to your discussions. And just having them there printed on your plans, really, and looking for opportunities to use them, maybe one section at a time, maybe sharing them with the students and just saying, look, I'm interested in being a bit more dialogic, if you will, when we're together. And these are some of the questions I'm going to be looking to ask you during our discussions. Maybe you can find opportunities to ask them too. Let's see if we can do this together. Right. I think the images on the right-hand side say it all here. We might hopefully end up with not just that kind of interaction where we're going from teacher initiation to student response to teacher evaluation and back again, that kind of ping-pong fashion, to a more distributed model of classroom talk, where students are engaging in dialogue with each other, and the teacher is, rather than evaluating, withholding evaluation, opening up dialogue a little bit more. show you a little video. So this, let me set the scene here. This is a scene from a US classroom. And again, the reference, the source of this video is on the references slide that we can share with you. And here, the teacher, just come out of here so I can see you before I start the share again. The teacher is encourage the students are engaged in a practical experiment where they're looking at what happens to the mass of water and the volume of water as it freezes. And the teacher's decided to call for predictions from the students because she feels that that will get them to take a stance, and that will get them interested, and that will get them thinking. And she's also made the decision that they should share those predictions with each other. So let's have a look at this video. And my question here really to you is, what do you notice based on what we've just discussed about those talk moves? What do you notice? Just bear with me while I make sure I share this in the proper way. Okay. I can no longer see any of you, so if there's any problem with audio quality or anything here, I'm reliant upon somebody shouting out at this point. Here you go. What do you notice?
Okay, can somebody read the question to me today? Terry, you want to read the question?
What happens to weight and volume when water freezes?
Okay.
I think that the weight will increase because we put it in the freezer and it's adding ice. So wait.
Okay, so it's adding ice. Can you say a little more?
Because when we put it into the freezer, from the ice from the coldness, some of the ice gets in the water.
Okay. So it's added into the water. So the water stays there and then ice is added into the water? Okay. How about Gabe?
The weight will increase because solids are more weight than liquids, because ice is a solid and water is a liquid, so when it's frozen it'll be solid.
Okay. Okay, Blairto, what did you write?
I wrote that I predict the weight will stay the same because water and ice have the same weight, just in a different shape.
I agree with what Blair just said.
Really? Can you explain why? Can you explain your thinking?
Because, like she said, that it will be the same weight. I think that it will because you're not adding anything and you're not taking anything away. So it's gonna be the same weight.
We discussed weight. Let's talk about volume. Who wants to share their thinking on volume?
I think the volume will be the same because you're not adding or taking away from the bottle.
I agree with that.
You do? Why?
Because just like she said, you're not adding or anything away. The water's just freezing and it'll stay the same size, just freezing.
Okay.
Question.
Yeah.
I respectfully disagree.
Oh. Okay. Why?
Because one time I was filling up my water bottle and then I left it to freeze overnight. And then when I opened it, when I opened the freezer, the water it was frozen, and then it went down the side of the bottle and the cap popped off.
Oh.
I think the volume will change because the water, which will turn into ice, will probably change volume but keep its weight.
Why?
Because water and ice have two different shapes. Water takes shape when it goes in the container. It takes that shape, and ice is a cube.
Ice is always a cube?
No, it can be other shapes too, like something like pointy or something.
So again, my question, which you could share in the chat, or maybe I'm almost tempted to start engaging in dialogue at this point, but then I think we might run out of time. But what do you notice about that video, or the moves that the teacher was making there? Or any thoughts, really? You value that kind of teaching? First comment I saw flashing up there, of course, was that they were sitting in a circle. You know, we shouldn't ignore that. If we are serious about, sometimes dialogue just occurs spontaneously and there's no time for all that movement. But if we are actually planning a session which is going to involve some dialogue, then it really is worth the effort of thinking about the seating arrangements. Because if we can all see each other, it really does help the quality of dialogue. If we can all genuinely attend to each other, then it really does help the quality of dialogue. So thank you for mentioning that and prompting me to remember that. I think we saw the teacher sitting on the same level of the students. I think the teacher being a part of the circle is a nice indication of the change in communicative approach, in a sense. So the teachers abandoned that position of power and authority out front and said, right, we're stopping that game now. Here's a new game. I'm here with you to think this through together. I'm now not putting in, I'm facilitating your thinking, and that can be a useful cue. And I think it takes a time for the students to get used to that idea that you don't just want them to give short right answers anymore. You know, we're learning together in a different way. Okay. I think we did see some of the moves there. I'm reading Graham's response, but I'm going to have to discipline myself to keep moving here. But we did see some of the moves there that we talked about. So the teacher was inviting students to say a little bit more, calling for explanations, calling for agreement and disagreement. So hopefully that was a useful demonstration of the use of some of those talk moves. Many thanks for all your comments. I wish we had longer, and I'd love to talk to you more about this, but I'm going to move on. Okay. Oh, I always do this. Adjust my settings here. There you go. So one other thing that perhaps came from that video is an opportunity within science education for sharing a dialogue about prediction, about all stages of practical work, actually, about raising questions in response to some sort of a stimulus, about designing an experiment, thinking about how we might carry out an investigation, about analysing data, about evaluating an experiment. These are all opportunities for some classroom dialogue, I think, and encouraging the students to think scientifically. I've spent some time thinking also about dialogue and conceptual understanding in science, and I think there's lots of exercises like the one shown here, concept exercises, that can be a good opportunity for some brief episodes of dialogue. So in this case, with relatively young children, do we have a grasp of what we mean by alive and not alive when we're studying living things together? Can you sort these things actually into categories of being alive and not alive? Are there any you're not sure about? And of course, that's the art for the teacher, making sure there are some that make us think a little bit. There are some obvious examples, but there are some that really stretch our understanding of what alive really means, that will provoke some useful dialogue. And we can imagine students engaged in small groups in this, and we can imagine plenary exercises where the teacher picks up on some of the perhaps difficulties that the students might be having. And then a very similar exercise here for slightly older students. Freezing, and we all know what freezing means. Well, not from the point of view of science, we don't. Amazing how many times I've had teachers do an exercise like this, and they've not been terribly confident, because we know what freezing means. It means being cold, doesn't it? It's freezing outside, it's cold. And that's right, that makes sense. That we all know what you mean. It's not wrong, but it's not what we're looking for from the point of view of science. There's a gap of difference here between the everyday and the scientific, and it might just be worth spending some time reasoning together across. How many of our students will say that lava cooling or gold freezing is not freezing because well, that's not 0 degrees C, is it? That's hot. It's too hot to freeze. And so, you know, an exercise like this can really help us to explore that concept in more depth. And despite the fact we've tried to transmit the definition of freezing in various different ways, we can't, of course, guarantee what sense the students have made of it. Talking points. So sometimes these just emerge spontaneously, but can also be planned for in our lessons. So we've been studying forces and Newton's laws. So an object stops moving when it runs out of force. An object stops moving when it runs out of force. We could just raise hands to express agreement or disagreement, or we could move. We can stand somewhere in the classroom to express our degree of agreement or disagreement, and we can engage in dialogue where there are differences of opinion and really go into you know, what we've really understood about force and Newton's laws. Some other examples there that you might find useful. But again, you could probably be thinking for yourself about the topics you're teaching with your students at the moment. What concepts are you engaging with that you could usefully stretch their understanding of through dialogue? And, you know, are there some talking points like these that you could offer your students to prompt relatively short episodes of some rich dialogue that might serve a purpose? There are lots of these concept exercises and so on. Here's a bit of a warning, I think. We've kind of looked at this kind of algorithmically in a way and said, look, if you use some of these talk moves, some of this language, use some of these exercises, you can create dialogue in the classroom. My experience is it's not so easy. It's not an algorithmic thing. A plus B plus C does not always equal dialogue. I think it's kind of an attitude. It's a way of being together as a group. Certainly as a teacher, it's a disposition to be willing to still oneself and turn to the students and genuinely listen to what they have to say and meet them where they're at and respond to them in relationship. I think that's a really powerful relationship, but I don't think it's so easy to achieve. So my cautionary message is just that it takes practice, not just for the students, but actually for us as teachers as well. It takes practice. So we can begin to practice using those talk moves I suggested. Here's one other way that I think is useful and it has a fair bit of evidence behind it in terms of research. And it sounds very simple, but it's just the use of ground rules in the classroom. So, you know, if we've shared with our students that we're trying to be a bit more dialogic together, we might usefully explore what that means. We might usefully acknowledge there are different kinds of talk. There are different modes of talking in different situations and different contexts. The kinds of persuasive talk that Martin Luther King is using there, and a confrontational talk that our politicians use, the kind of chit chat that we use when we're with our friends. These are different modes of communication to the one that we're after in the classroom, which might best be characterized by these images. If this is what we're after, productive talk for learning well together, what was that definition I shared with you? Talking for better understanding together. We might usefully ask the students, how do we need to be? What we need to do in order to achieve that quality of talk? And I'll tell you, here's a list that I think comes from Cambridge University's Thinking Together project. You know, if you elicit these from the students, they'll tell you pretty similar things. And you can always throw one or two of these suggestions in also. We're going to need to listen attentively. We're going to need to explore what attentively means and how we genuinely listen. We need to make sure it's inclusive, that people feel willing to share, generously enough to share, but also authentically, not just what they think the right answer is, but to share their thoughts genuinely, authentically with the class. To build and respond, well, I don't need to read through the whole list, you can see them there. But I think if we have these ground rules and we try to focus on them sometimes in a discussion, so today we've talked about this need to build and respond to each other's ideas. Let's really try and focus on that together today. Here's a bit of help. You know, we're going to build and respond. What does that mean to build and respond to each other's ideas? Well, here's some language you might like to practice using today. The names are obviously inserted, but you have a go. Why don't you, let's try and see if we can practice using this language so that we do build and respond today. And actually, I think I took this slide out, but I want to say it anyway. It's also useful if you have the time to reflect at the end and just say, did you see that? Did we succeed? Did we build and respond to each other today? How do you know? What did you hear? Was it helpful? Why was it helpful? How did this language help us? And for me, that's a process of metacognition, of coming to, we do some of this stuff anyway, of course we do. We do it often subconsciously. And it's about trying to make it a bit more conscious and deliberate so that we can begin to take control of our own thinking in dialogue. We get better at it as time goes on. We get richer discussions as time goes on. And over time, we can focus on different ground rules, make those the focus of our sessions so that we explore this, we're progressive, we get better at dialogue. And as I say, it's a hard message for me to give it in this talk in a way, but I've recorded lots of students talking around exercises like the ones I showed you. And where there hasn't been any effort made to teach them how to engage in productive dialogue, the quality of the talk is often, not always, often not what you'd want and not terribly productive. You get things like one confident child dominating the whole discussion very often, and sometimes also giving the wrong answer while at the same time as dominating the discussion, and others don't challenge them, and so on. So, it's a hard message, but I think we need to teach the dialogue proactively and practice it proactively if we're to get to the quality of talk that really will make a difference for us. Speaking of practicing the skills of dialogue, Generation Global has its own fantastic resource called Essentials of Dialogue. And I've also included a hyperlink to that in the reference list that I've given you. Really some wonderful exercises to carry out with students on trying to engage them in what dialogue means and to practice the fundamental skills of dialogue together. So do have a look at that. Just changing tack slightly as we come toward the end of the session. I feel sometimes, or two things really, I feel sometimes that open questions, genuinely open questions to which there is more than one possible right answer, or philosophical questions, are good practice grounds for dialogue actually, and they're good opportunities to practice that different mode of interaction that we can then later apply to more closed questions, where we acknowledge that need to switch back to the authoritative. Excuse me. So I think that's important, but I also think that these questions are a part of understanding science as well. So yes, it's important that young people understand the science behind climate change, what causes the greenhouse effect and global warming and so on. But it's also important to them that it's meaningful for them. And this time, I'm using the word meaning in a slightly different sense. I think that a lot of research suggests that our students become disaffected with their science education and fail to pursue science at later stages of their education because they feel it's meaningless. It's a lot of abstract information that doesn't really relate to them and their lives. So part of our job, and this is a wider part of being dialogic really in a sense, is to make those connections to their lived experiences, to make the content speak to them and their lives. And again, the Generation Global offer, as you may know, offer a series of topics that students can engage in, both online and in video conferences in dialogue, global warming being one of them. And they get the opportunity to engage in questions like these, not so much to talk about the science of global warming, but what impact is this having on people like me, like you, my peers from around the world? What are you seeing happening where you live? And whose responsibility is all this? Is this really us that should be doing something about it, or is this the politicians? Or who is this? What should we do about it? And I think that's a great, those video conferences, a great opportunity for practicing the kind of dialogue that we're talking about. And there are other topics that Generation Global offer that could be adapted to a more scientific purpose as well. We can certainly give you more information about that if you were interested. Other kinds of open and philosophical questions. This is a Eurocentric one. We often refer to Galileo as the first European, in brackets, scientist. Why so? What was he doing that made him a scientist? I.e., what is science? How does that work as a way of knowing about the world, and what are its limits? I think these are questions we should be engaging our students with as part of our science education. And again, great opportunities for practicing dialogue. You may notice me wearing a silly hat in my younger days there. So we try to do this with a bit of drama as well around it, creating opportunities for dialogue with a little bit of drama involved as well. Went a stage further on this one. This was actually occurred on stage in a theatre, where we told a story that involved genetic screening and raised various ethical questions about science, which again, we have to engage our students with, I think. You know, most of our students won't go on to be scientists, but they'll all be consumers of science. They'll all be touched by science. They should all be able to participate in discussions about the implications of what scientists do and the ethics and the rights and wrongs of that. So in this case, you know, we can perform genetic screening, but does that mean we should? And for what purposes might that be acceptable? And of course, we don't need the full drama to go with that. There are opportunities, and again, coming back to these simple ideas, we can throw some of these ethical, epistemological questions into our teaching as we go along. So the success of vaccination justifies Jenner's methods, which, let's remind ourselves, involved injecting an unsuspecting and unwilling volunteer with cowpox, which was potentially ethically questionable, but does the end justify the means? And there are some other things that I thought of. And again, I'm sure if you think back to the topics you're teaching at the moment, there'll be some of these epistemological or ethical questions that you might think you could throw in there. And a nice opportunity again to get the students moving around the classroom and indicating their level of agreement. And they can stand on a line to indicate a continuum, or agree to disagree, or they can stand in corners to indicate whether you strongly agree or kind of agree but not quite sure, or and so on. You know the idea. Well, I was worried about the time, and I needn't have been, so there will be time for questions. But just one last thought. I always put this one up because I'm arguing that we need to spend time educating students, not just through dialogue, but for dialogue, teaching them how to engage better in dialogue. And that takes some of our time as educators. But I also just think it's always useful to remind ourselves that the outcomes of that are great. Dialogue is so important in our world today, always has been, I guess. We don't have to look far in the news to remind ourselves of why the ability to understand each other, to reason across gaps of difference, is so terribly important, as Dimitri Nikulin reminds us there. So I always console myself by I'm investing time in teaching children how to dialogue, but I think the outcome of that is great. Is really important in its own right, and I also hope it leads to richer teaching and learning across the curriculum. I'll just say that there are some headlines here, a sort of summary of some of the things I've tried to get across in the time we have. So students need opportunities to recreate or make meaning of the knowledge we're trying to teach them. Dialogue's one way in which we can do this. A useful distinction I find is the one between me as teacher in authoritative mode and me as teacher in dialogic mode. And I think it's useful to acknowledge that I may be more often authoritative than I am dialogic, and to try practicing switching between the two. One way of doing that is to apply some of those talk moves we looked at, to throw those into my interactions with the students, to try to practice turning to the other. Key thing actually is listening as well, really genuinely trying to listen to what they have to say. Dialogue, I think, needs to be taught and practiced, and the use of ground rules is one relatively simple and something that doesn't consume lots of time, but one relatively simple way of doing that, which I think has good research evidence behind it. Open-ended, more philosophical questions can be a good ground for practicing dialogue in science, but I think they're an important part of science education as well. You know, those ethical, epistemological, philosophical questions, I think, are important. And my final flourish there, the value of this dialogue extends beyond science education, or beyond school altogether. It's a really important outcome in its own right. I've shared that slide with Lisa that she may well share with you if you'd be interested to have it. And also this list of references, so some of the ideas I've been drawing on here. The video clip, for example, there's the link, The Essentials of Dialogue, and some the talk science primer from Michaels and O'Connor. Some of the things I've drawn on. If you want to go deeper into dialogue in science education, by the way, a book by Mortimer and Scott, Making Meaning in Secondary Science Education, is one that will take you a little bit deeper. And then some of the posts and things that you may find to be of interest. Okay, I'm going to end the slideshow there. And if we have time, just invite any questions. I don't know if you've noticed any in the chat list that have popped up.
Well, I invite anybody, if there's a burning question you have, to please just open your mic and ask it. We only have just a short time left, but does anybody have a burning question? You could type it in the chat too, but it might be better to just ask it aloud.
Thanks for a bit of dialogue after all. Great.
Hi, good evening.
Hi, Divya. Please go ahead.
Just wanted to know how well can we integrate science with other subjects if we are talking of climate change? And if I need to integrate this, I teach about it in science, we talk about it, we have a dialogue on it in the classroom, and then I need to integrate it with, say, social studies. How can we do that? Through a dialogue.
I'm imagining that maybe others on the call that can answer that better than I, but let me just tell you first, the theatre slide I showed you there of the genetic screening projects that we did was very much cross-curricular. So we looked at the science behind genetic screening, of course, but we had the art department making the provocative posters, graphical designs to tease out some of the ethical issues involved in that. We had the music department writing the score for the engaging with students in writing songs, and with the drama, it was all a drama production. We had English involved. So that these things can form the basis of some fantastic cross-curricular learning. I have to acknowledge a lack of expertise in regards to your specific question of how we might encourage other disciplines to engage in the projects of global warming. Do others have a response to that question?
Thank you. I'm waiting, looking forward.
Alexandra, you raised your hand. Do you have a response to Divya?
Yeah, we've in our school in the UAE, we've just started designing project-based learning, but with sustainable development goals at the heart of it. So the overarching sort of point of the project, it starts from something within a climate change sort of based area, and then from that the students work in groups to design their project. So for example, one thing that we've got in a year 2 class, they're building insect like bug hotels. So that's bringing in like the DT, it's bringing in like the science part with animals and living things, animals and their habitats, and yet it's also addressing the climate issue of the problem of like insects dying off and things like that. So just through that kind of project-based learning is what we've found works really well.
Thank you so much. That's really good.
Many thanks, Alexandra. And Mariana, do you want to speak to the same question, Mariana, or do you have a different question?
No, it's a different one. Can I?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, more than a question is like, I would like to ask for your suggestion. In our academic program, we have like 11, 13 topics, and inside each, we have to teach like 15 keywords or something like that. So when I try to do dialogue, which I think it's pretty useful, and I love it, by the way, my huge problem is when we do this, we can only discuss one keyword. Maybe it's the main topic, right? Like, what's the cell? But that means I will not have enough time to finish the whole topic. When I was supposed to study in that class, I don't know, maybe the full animal cell. So my big deal is, how can I deal with time and accomplishing or finishing the complete program? Because I need to, at the end, reach the same goal as my peers because we're going to apply the same final exam. So I'm always like fighting against time and all this topic content.
Yeah, Mariano, I think that's a question that everybody here will have in their minds, and one that we all grapple with. And again, I can't really say that there's an easy answer, but an important answer is that, we want understanding here, we want deep learning here. And so many of our education systems, we've put so much content in there and set ourselves such tight schedules to deliver that content that we race through it and we feel, well, we've done our job. I've got to, we've got a week to go before the exam and I've finished. I've delivered the content successfully. Have the students understood it? And it comes back to that, I said I taught him, not that he'd learned. Have the students learned it? Do they have a deeper understanding of it? Do they have a deeper appreciation of it so that they may wish to go on and study it at advanced level? Not necessarily. And so I think it's always worth reflecting in your departments about that need for deeper learning, and where possible, at least selecting those pivotal concepts that underpin a secure understanding of that topic. Without that, you can't really appreciate this topic, and building in at least some short opportunities for deeper exploration. It's easy for me to say and hard for you to do sometimes. And again, I'd invite anybody else to respond to that question if they would like to.
Thanks, Neil. I'm going to interject here because I know that we are over time, but there are some really valuable questions in the chat. And I would agree. I would invite people, if you have responses to any of what we're discussing, to please put it in the chat. In the interest of time, there is one more question that I think, though, that I think we could address here, because I think it's a pretty powerful one. A few people have pointed to it, but Maria had asked how to deal with promoting dialogue in a class where students may have extreme religious positions around science. And I think maybe a bigger question here, and someone else had pointed out, is how do you create dialogue across those, big cultural or religious gaps around science? Any thoughts on that before we close out?
Oh, thanks, Lisa, for that nice, easy question to end the session with. Obviously, this is one you encounter, and I think I come back to the phrase "reason across difference." So, I think that we have to have a space where we can acknowledge and value the different perspectives on these questions of evolution, for example. So there are different perspectives on that between the disciplines of religious education, theology, and science, and those should be acknowledged and validated, and there should be a space where those can be talked about, brought into tension together without causing offence, I feel. And that's not really giving a very detailed answer as to how one might do it. I'm actually engaged I work for an organisation on philosophy for children, and we're engaged at the moment in an extended project with science departments and with religious education departments, trying to get them working together to explore some of these issues, to create spaces where some of these different ways of knowing can be acknowledged and valued and explored. I'm not, that's a sort of equivocal answer, I think, Lisa, without being a particularly useful one. Apologies.
No. I think you're right. It's a big question, and there's a lot of nuance inside of that. And I think what you point to is really useful to consider, less about maybe some of those differences and more about how we create spaces. I think that's a really valid point that you make, is ways in which we can create spaces, and that's going to happen beyond the classroom, right? That's going to happen with our schools, right? We're going to work with our community, with our leaders, with our parents. Someone mentioned here about not wanting to surprise parents with curriculum. And so it's really quite a complicated response to a complicated question. And I think you just make a really good point about how we bring all community stakeholders together to create safe spaces for that to happen. I think that's a really good point. So I'm going to have to pause us there. So I can see this is quite popular, and there's a lot of really valid questions here. So we'll definitely consider how we can create a future space to continue this conversation. And so we'll go back and look at that. I want to thank everyone for your time, and especially Neil, thank you so much. This has been incredibly insightful. It's been such rich examples, rich tips and strategies for bringing dialogue into the science classroom. And so really, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your experience with us. This has been great. And I just want to ask, I know some of you might have to leave, and that's fine, but we had 2 quick poll questions we wanted to just put up to ask you for a little bit of feedback. So if you wouldn't mind just quickly doing those before you sign out. So I think we've put feedback question number 1, and we're not going to share these results. So if you could just please take a minute to quickly answer that. See if we can get a fair amount almost there. Okay, great. Looking good. And perhaps then if we could end that poll, and we'll just have one more quick question for you. Thank you. And here's the second one. All right. Thanks everyone for just taking a minute. I appreciate that. All right, great. I think we're good there. So thank you so much. And we hope to see you again, whether it's in another webinar or spoiler alert, we're going to be having some educator video conferences coming up so you can experience what your students experience with each other. And please stay tuned throughout the summer for more events in our teacher community. Thank you so much for being part of our community. Thank you, Neil, and everyone have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks.